Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of what I hope will be several informances that I will do for you about the Lake County Symphony Orchestra, about some of the music that we play, why we play it, how decisions are made to play certain kinds of music, and then about the music itself, specifically about how composers treat the orchestra and write for symphony orchestras like the LCSO and hundreds of thousands of orchestras around the world. My name is Ron Arden, and I'm the Artistic and Executive Director of the Lake County Symphony Orchestra. Most of you know me, and welcome to this first time. I wanted to begin by sharing with you that, like many orchestras, we were planning to do a celebration of Beethoven's 250th birthday this year. The beginning of that was a beautiful overture that we did on the opening, at the opening of our February concert called Timeless Classics, which we do every year. It was a spectacular performance, and I actually have clips from that performance for you to hear tonight. But first I want to talk a little bit about Beethoven and why he's such a giant in the music world. 250 years is not the only reason we were all going to celebrate his birthday, but indeed his place in history as a musician, as a composer, is unparalleled. He was German, obviously, born in 1770 and passed away in 1827. Most of you know Beethoven by the very famous Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You might then know him, if you ever played piano, by a piece called Für Elise, which was a composition that he wrote for a child named Elise. And then finally, Beethoven's Ninth, which was the first symphony ever to use a choir and soloists, and that's in the last movement, where Beethoven wrote the famous Ode to Joy melody that we now know as a hymn, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. Those three pieces are probably the top three user-friendly for folks who don't know a lot about classical music. And it's okay to not know a lot. In fact, my presentations to you are meant to be stimulating for the professional musician, but also what I call music appreciation at the college level friendly. I don't want to use a lot of really complicated stories and terms for you, but I do want you to learn something if you're into that. And I especially want you to get to know the whole idea of how we plan concerts for the LCSO quite a bit better. So here I am in my music room talking to you about Beethoven. I can't think of something that I would rather do more than this, to be honest with you. He was from Germany, obviously, was a composer and a pianist, and he had a musical father, a musical family. His father was actually his first teacher. He eventually moved to Vienna and spent most of his life there. I have an interesting story about Vienna and Germany. I was in a choir at First Presbyterian Church in Houston. I was a paid ringer there, and the choir went to Austria on a trip, and I had never been to Europe. And the first night we were supposed to be in, first two nights actually, we were supposed to be in Vienna. We were divided into two buses, and they made a mistake in the hotel reservations, and one of the buses had to go outside of Vienna downtown to a small town called Mödling, Austria. Turns out Mödling is where Beethoven went on retreat to write his symphonies. I was freaked out, I have to tell you. So Beethoven spent a lot of his time in the Vienna woods, where lots of his music comes from. I think he was probably just inspired, and it was the musical hub of the world at the time, so it was a really good reason for Beethoven to be there. He is probably the most performed composer in all of what we like to call classical music. Classical is a term that we use to cover all serious symphonic, vocal, instrumental music that people study in college and that you hear on symphony stages and in concert halls all over the world. It specifically is about an era of music that includes Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, three very famous composers, but we still use the overall word as a title for all of Western music. Specifically, though, classical comes from the idea that the music at the time reflected art and history and literature, and it did have that very calculated, very regal, extremely well put together and formulated feeling about it, and that's hence the word classical. Beethoven wrote in three different periods of his life. There are other very famous composers that have what we who have studied music history like to call periods of music. There were three periods for Beethoven, with recently found out by me, I didn't know this little bit of history, quite a bit of a break between period 2 and period 3. Period 3 is where we find the Beethoven Symphony number 9 and some of the late quartets that really, if you studied music in college, my musical friends will understand this. If Beethoven had only lived maybe another 5 years, his third period was so progressive that we would have seen and heard the music of Brahms and Tchaikovsky, the great romantics. Beethoven was pressing the envelope with his writing in that third period. So he's, as I mentioned before, in the group with Haydn and Mozart, two of the greatest classical music composers of the time. But he is literally Beethoven, because of what I just said, the bridge from classicism to great romantic music. You all may know that Beethoven was deaf. In fact, they have stories, they're undocumented, but stories of concerts where Beethoven was conducting one of his symphonies. Sometimes it's the fifth, sometimes it's the ninth. The stories vary. And he was so deaf at the time that when he was done conducting what he knew was on the page, he had to be turned around because he couldn't hear the audience's applause. There's some controversy about the level of Beethoven's deafness, when it started happening, how deep it was, but we have proof that Beethoven, by the time we get into the third period, really couldn't hear anything, which is a little mind-boggling. And for those of you who don't know much about music, pretty exciting to know that somebody has all this music in their head and can get it down on paper, but will actually never hear it. Pretty exciting stuff, I think. He wrote symphonies, that is, large four-movement works for an orchestra of 50 to 75 people. He wrote string quartets, all kinds of what we call chamber music, or music that was performed and paid for by royalty for their chamber concerts in their homes, much like my music room here. My music room isn't quite big enough to have an audience, but back in the day, there were chambers in palaces and residences where people would have special concerts. I think it'd be fun to do some of that today. Maybe we will sometime. There are a lot of piano solo works, piano concertos, a very beautiful violin concerto, a wonderful work for violin, cello, and piano called the Beethoven Triple. It's just magnificent music. And some vocal music, but not a lot. He also wrote a piece called Missa Alumnus, which I just heard last year downtown Chicago at the Harris Theater. It was an amazing performance by the Chicago Philharmonic and the chorus that sings for Grant Park. I think it was raining, otherwise it would have been outside. It was stellar, one of the best performances I've heard in Chicago. And the Missa Solemnis is a 45 to 50-minute work that boggles the mind of most of us who know traditional classical music, because you could walk into the concert hall and if you didn't know that it was Beethoven's music and you were hearing it for the first time, you wouldn't automatically say, that's Beethoven. Because as I said, in this third period, he was painting so far outside the lines of what was tradition at the day. Well, tonight, now that I've given you kind of an introduction, we're going to hear the Beethoven Overture, Leonore, number 3, from his only opera, Fidelio. Before we listen, let me just give you a tiny bit of background, and then we'll cut to some of the takes that we have for you tonight. I'm not going to hear the whole overture, just some pieces. So Fidelio was written at the end of his second period in about 1814. It took him 10 years to finish it. It was a long and complicated process and history of the opera for Beethoven. It wasn't his it wasn't his favorite thing to do, is the best way I can put it. He didn't write any other operas. The opera's not very much performed. It's not up there with Verdi and Puccini or even any of the great Mozart operas. But the overture has its own little history. The story of Fidelio is about a woman who disguises herself as a prison guard named Fidelio, and she goes in to rescue her husband from death in a political prison. It sounds like a soap opera, right? Most operas are very much like that. So operas, like musicals, will often have overtures that give you a reflection, a pre-story reflection of some of the tunes and themes that you're going to hear in the opera or the musical. And the Leonore Overture is like that. Eventually, it was changed from Fidelio to Leonore just for the overture. Leonore is another figure in the opera. There were 4 overtures written all together. Beethoven wasn't real thrilled with a couple of them. One of them was too long and had to be shortened. And finally, there was one, the Leonore number 3, which has survived the most as a concert overture, in other words, performed aside from the opera. And it became so famous that eventually there were people in the musical world that would do the opera and insert Leonore Overture number 3 in between the first 2 scenes of the second act. There's some controversy there too. There's so much controversy in music. We artists, we have a lot of drama going on in our lives, and Beethoven was dramatic himself. So it was frustrating for Beethoven. The whole idea of writing the opera was not his favorite thing, and so I'm using it because we just played it, and I want to demonstrate to you some things about Beethoven, about his writing, and about his life that you'll be able to hear in the music. Before we hear this first clip from the Beethoven, let's talk about 3 things that I would like for you to listen for in his music. I think it's very important to kind of set you up so that you can reflect with me on how Beethoven is this amazing bridge between the classical era and the romantic era of the 19th century. I want us to think about 3 words: innovation, creativity, and exploration. So innovation and exploration are not exactly the same. To me, innovation is determined, exploration is unknown, and creativity is the caveat for all of it. All of art is creative, it's energetic, and it's passionate. So we're going to listen to the opening of the overture, which is this incredibly austere, slow, very, very soft blanket of sound, almost like a Monet painting. It's impressionistic in a sense. And then I want you to listen for sudden dynamic contrasts, which would not be indicative of the classical period up until now. Beethoven was, among us classical musicians, the king of going from really soft to really loud and back and forth like that. Again, he just was excited by that. And that in itself, if you whisper and then shout or do the opposite, is very dramatic. And we do that in talking to each other for dramatic effect. So there are these incredibly soft levels, and then the loud parts to come. The opening chord is this huge sound from the orchestra, and immediately we go to the blanket. So look for those levels. Look then also for transparency in the writing, duets between instruments. There's a wonderful duet of violas and bassoons of all instruments in this opening. There's a wonderful duet between the first flute and the first violin section. And the passages are very austere. If you were to do something like what we call drop the needle on a recording of this piece, right in the middle of where we're going to listen, you would be hard-pressed to know exactly where you are in the life of classical music. So let's take a listen, and then we'll talk. I can tell you from playing that passage as a violist that it's always kind of a spooky moment to know exactly where the beat is. You have to trust what you see on the page. And as a conductor, I just lay down the beat and let the music do its own thing. So that's what I would call very creative and very innovative on Beethoven's part. And it explores rhythm in a way that had not yet been done. The next clip is one of my favorites, and our principal trumpet player, Wesley Woodward, plays this really beautifully. It's a moment where the strings have this amazing rush of sound in 16th notes and then come to a complete stop, and the trumpet, all on its own, plays sort of what we would call an ad-lib moment in the middle of the music. Let's listen. I hope you enjoyed that. That's some pretty wonderful playing by the LCSO, and also demonstrates this idea of innovation and creativity and exploring the orchestral tapestry, dynamic range, going from large orchestra to just a couple of instruments. The next clip is going to show you something that you may not have ever heard of before. It's the word syncopation. In music, there is a beat, and up until now, pretty much in all of music, music falls what we call on the beat. So bum bum ba-dum bum 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 bum, like a Sousa march, right? In Beethoven's music, we're going to take the beat, and the melody or the harmony or whatever he's writing is going to go off the beat. And you're going to hear that in the orchestra in this next section. This would be very non-regular in the classical music period. Let's listen. Beethoven is really changing the landscape of how we listen to the orchestra, and he does it with these syncopations and these solo moments and the transparency that's going on. The creation of drama, I think, as you've heard so far in the clips, often also comes from these very, very soft passages exploding into louder passages and back and forth. There's sort of an eerie anticipation of something that's not indicative of classical music. Classical music is not predictable in a bad sense, but something that you can count on to go a certain way, right? And so the beginning of Beethoven being this bridge is to be more romantic, to be more passionate, to be exploring his heart in the music through these various tools of creativity, syncopation and dynamics and all of that. So the last clip that we're going to listen to is a little bit longer. It takes us to a point in the piece that I'm going to describe in a moment, out to the end. It's a very, very offbeat, difficult moment for the strings of the orchestra. You're going to hear a small duet between the first violins and the flute. Again, Beethoven loved this. And then the first violins are going to start what we call a round or a canon, but on very fast 16th notes. And the 16th notes are off the beat. And the second violins have to anticipate and jump in and get on the train, so to speak, and then the violas, and then the basses and cellos. And the LCSO played this brilliantly. It's a little bit of an awkward moment in symphonic music because we as players are not expecting Beethoven to throw this curveball at us where the music is so fast and off the beat. And then after that moment, it explodes into the coda where there is what can only be called Beethoven's brilliant ability to have unbridled explosion and happiness. And that's how the overture ends. So let's take a listen. I hope that you have truly enjoyed this little bit of picking apart at Beethoven and talking about how he is the bridge between classical music and the Romantic era, and listening to the LCSO. And I hope you'll join me again next month when we're going to be talking about the Vaughan Williams Tuba Concerto, which our principal tubist, Josh Savigny, played so beautifully. It's an amazing piece, very different from the Beethoven. But for now, stay well, stay happy, hug those that you can, your family and friends that are close to you. And again, I'm sorry that we can't be on stage for you. And this is a poor second, but at least we're with you. And we want you to know that the LCSO is alive and well. And we are practicing and getting ready for when we can play for you again. Happy birthday, Beethoven. See you soon.